Risen is a 2009 RPG developed by Piranha Bytes. Yes, that Piranha Bytes. The same studio who brought us pinnacles of Eurojank RPGs such as the Gothic series and Elex. But that's a subject for a future video. Risen is an interesting case for several reasons. On the one hand, it was the first game Piranha Bytes put out after the, I don't wanna say disastrous, but misguided Gothic 3, which saw the German studio both exploring more experimental avenues and trying to tap into the open world RPG mania of the early to mid-aughts. It was a time when many RPG developers were trying to replicate the success of Morrowind and Oblivion. The problem was that just as many of them, including Piranha Bytes, didn't have the budget nor the experience to pull it off. And that's how Gothic 3 came to be. A game that, as graphically advanced and ambitious as it was, didn't quite capture what made the first two games special and alienated a large majority of their fanbase. So Risen marked their temporary return to roots. Small but dense maps, a skill point trainer-based progression system, factions with mutually exclusive quest lines, a fleshed out world with its own social structure and politics, a plethora of tiny mechanics meant to boost player immersion. Jack the Old Lighthouse Keeper. Yes, he's in Risen too. Everybody loves Jack, so here he is. He might talk like an old man and have the body of a buff 30-year-old dude, but you know, he's just built different. So yeah, that's Risen. One last crack at their old school RPG formula before locking them in a drawer and throwing the key away. One more DJ Premier produced boom bap mixtape to please the old timers before finally taking their shot at this trap thing all the kids are listening to. They did bridge the generational gap by inviting Tyler the Creator and Denzel Curry to spit a few raps, but overall it's still the same familiar waters. Anyway, let's jump in. Actually wait, please be warned that I'll be comparing Risen with Gothic 2 quite a lot in this video. Okay, now let's jump in.
Thanks for your help.
You've been through enough. You deserve a bit of kindness.
In fine Piranha Bytes tradition, Risen's story debuts with a catastrophe of epic proportions. I had a hard time making out what's happening in the cutscene, so if you're like me and have the attention span of a newborn puppy, here's the gist of it. You, the nameless character soon to become hero, are a stowaway on a small ship. Somewhere near Farang Island, where the game is set, a huge hulking chad of a creature known as a Titan attacks the ship with the force of 1,000 crypto bros trying to defend their hobby at a family dinner. The ship is destroyed and you wash up on the shores unharmed. What's a Titan, you ask? Well, here's where things get interesting. See, Risen is not your typical fantasy setting. It all started in an event predating the story of Risen called the Dark Wave. Having had enough of the cosmic power plays and oppression that they've been subjected to for centuries, humankind used magic to drive away the gods ruling them. Not 5 minutes had passed since the last god fucked off to move back with their disappointed parents that the consequences of their banishment already started taking effect. Humankind made a terrible mistake. By banishing the gods, they inadvertently unleashed the Titans, ancient monsters that were sealed away and kept in check by the same celestial beings they told to shove it. On top of that, ancient temple ruins started rising from the ground seemingly out of nowhere, leading to sporadic earthquakes. To make things even sweeter, Faranga is now surrounded by constant storms, making the island virtually inaccessible to the outside world. Enter Inquisitor Mendoza. Believing that the island holds the secret to defeating the Titans, he leads the Warriors of the Order, a paramilitary wing of the Inquisition, to Faranga. They take over Harbor Town, driving Don Esteban and his men out, and settle in the monastery to use it as a base of operation to train recruits. Your head's probably spinning from all the name drops, so here's a brief summary of all the factions so we're on the same page. The Inquisition. A military religious organization. Their leader, Inquisitor Mendoza, rules the island with an iron fist, forbidding people from entering or leaving Harbor Town without authorization. Those who do are kidnapped and forcibly recruited. They've also taken to exploring the ruins and confiscating artifacts for scientific research. Rating: fucking assholes. The Bandits. Criminals and outlaws of all sorts of backgrounds and specializations. Their leader, the charismatic Don Esteban, used to rule his men with an iron fist. until they were banished from Harbor Town by the Inquisition and retreated to the swamps. Nowadays, he's too distracted with his pet project, namely squeezing ruins dry of gold and artifacts, to notice that some of his underlings have started running protection rackets under his nose. Rating assholes, but they do have some redeeming qualities. The mages. I didn't care much for them. They're mages. Rating, what the fuck were you thinking? Each faction is super interesting to analyze in its own way. Unlike the Gothic games, where despite its gritty and realistic take on the fantasy genre, there was a clear delineation between the quote-unquote good and bad guys, Risen goes for a more nuanced approach. Things are more morally grey this time around, to the point that you're constantly questioning yourself on whether you made the good decision by offering your allegiance to one faction or another. Let's start with the Inquisition. Now, the name by itself invokes some pretty nasty imagery and might push some people to root against them from the very beginning. And admittedly, they are a bunch of assholes. They kidnap locals and recruit them forcibly. They barged into Harbor Town, imposed their tyrannical rule, and gutted the economy, throwing thousands of people into poverty. But, and you knew this was coming, its leader, Inquisitor Mendoza, is one of the only characters who has the island's, and by extension humanity's, best interests at heart. Mendoza wants to fix the damage done by the mages and save humanity from dying at the hands of the Titans, as he believes that it's humanity's turn to rule over the world after being enslaved by the gods for generations. Of course, his Machiavellian outlook on things makes meeting him halfway quite difficult, so whether his methods are justified by the seemingly noble cause of saving humanity is up for debate and for you to decide. Next on the list are the Bandits, a very interesting faction to analyze and the one I ended up joining. Led by the charismatic Don Esteban, the Bandits are, well, bandits. They do typical bandit shit. They plunder and steal and assert their authority through violence and intimidation. You'd think they'd be hated, however their relationship with Faranga's inhabitants is a bit more complex than that. Before they were driven out of Harbor Town by the Inquisition, Don Esteban ruled Harbor Town as a sort of glorified institutionalized racket. The ships coming in and out of the port ensured he had a steady stream of gold and trinkets to fill his pockets, and enough supplies to keep the city economically viable at a basic level. You got the slums with its shanties and shabby merchant stalls, the port district with its pubs and brothels, and the upper class merchant district. You wouldn't exactly call it a metropolis, but at least it's functional. Of course, being run by a criminal organization, Harbor Town wasn't really the nicest place to live in. Even so, the few inhabitants that are brave enough to open up to you talk with a mixture of nostalgia and resentment about the days when the Dawn ruled over the city. Things were bad, but at least people were free to get out of the city and make a living as hunters or adventurers. Now everybody's just stuck inside with no jobs and future prospects. These are just tidbits of information I've pieced together from multiple NPCs, by the way. I've always had a, let's say, academic interest in places where criminal organizations act as systems of government. Sadly, the game doesn't dedicate too much time exploring these social dynamics, which is a huge missed opportunity in my opinion. I would have loved to find out what form of policing, if any, this place had in its relationship with the ruling criminals, or how Don Esteban's presence and influence dictated the social and political climate of the city. I'm fully aware this is a AA RPG with titans and gnomes and not a sociology paper, but I believe these small games could be the perfect conduits for exploring these interesting topics that are maybe too niche and risky for mainstream games. Take Gothic 2, which made the point of showing that the player character's heroic deed at the end of Gothic 1 triggered a chain of events that made things worse. So here's what happened. The player character defeated the big bad, which destroyed the magical barrier surrounding the prison, which freed thousands of prisoners who formed into gangs that proceeded to rob merchants and disrupt supply lines, which in turn thwarted the war effort against the orcs. Again, I would have loved to see this subtle choice and consequence type of storytelling logic applied to the bandits, but that's not the case here. Last but not least are the mages. Now, I gave them a lot of shit earlier in the video for causing this whole mess in the first place, but as you might have expected, things weren't as black and white as I made them seem. So the mages are an order whose mission is the advancement of magic and humankind. Their history can be traced prior to the Dark Wave, when the order alternated between blind worship of the gods and agnosticism. Sometime during their brush with screw you dad you don't get it agnosticism phase, They realize that the gods have long served their purpose and that humans should be allowed to carve their own path in the universe. One of their own, whose identity is unknown, so let's just call him fuckface-itis, started fucking around with some forbidden types of powerful magic and banished the gods from the world, releasing the titans in the process. In their defense, this was done without the knowledge and approval of the rest of the order. Had the perpetrator asked for permission, he would have probably been slapped with a collective hell no, as the risk was too high. As it stands, I like to imagine the culprit was an overly eager intern who wanted to impress a girl. I'm gonna level with you, this is the faction I've probably interacted the least with. The most interesting part about the mages is that they've ended up being victims of the Inquisition's maniacal zealotry as much as the random inhabitants of Oranga. During the events of Risen, the mages are an independent organization only in name, as the Inquisition have taken control of the monastery and set up shop there. Again, Risen doesn't give too many details, but in this case I think it's okay. A little mystery never hurt anybody.
Fungus. My favorite.
From a presentation standpoint, Risen represented a significant technological leap for Piranha Bytes. The Gothic games, free included, give off this DIY vibe that, while endearing, can be hugely off-putting to people with a low tolerance to jank, kinda like my videos. With Risen, Piranha Bytes have shown a clear aspiration to hang up their Jankmaster boots and take a shot at the big boy league. So first, they hired a lot of acting talent to voice the characters. John Rhys Davis voices Don Esteban. Andy Serkis, yes, that Andy Serkis plays Inquisitor Mendoza. Lena Headey is here. Granted, this is pre-Game of Thrones Lena Headey, but she was already a well-respected actress before she played Cersei. And they do a great job too. The Gothic games are notorious for their almost Deus Ex level of bad voice acting, but here I didn't notice any dubious performances. Judging by the gameplay footage I've seen over the years, I was under the impression that the player character is devoid of any sort of personality, and that perception remained valid for the first maybe 5 hours of the game. He grew on me quite a lot through the course of the campaign though. I especially like how his demeanor changes as you advance the story, and it's really satisfying seeing him growing from a confused stowaway to a badass that doesn't take shit from anyone. He's also a funny and snarky son of a bitch. While we are on the subject of sound, Kai Rosenkrantz, who also wrote the soundtrack for the Gothic trilogy, returned to compose the score for Risen. He's always had a knack for perfectly capturing the vibe of Piranha Bytes' worlds through sound. His music evokes a sense of adventure, rugged beauty and danger at the same time, which is really hard to pull off. The ambiental song playing while exploring the wilderness is some of the most beautiful music I've heard in a video game. It's just so... Fuck, I'm gonna talk about the immersive design and exploration later in the video, so let's just say that the music has a big contribution to that. The ambiental music heard in the swamp, where the bandit camp is located, is exactly what you'd expect to hear in that place. I don't know if this makes any sense, but this song somehow captures the idea, the concept of a ragtag group of banished outlaws struggling to build their way back to the top through sound. For dungeons and catacombs, Kai Rosenkrantz went for ambiental tracks. The goal here was to build tension, to make the player feel the psychological pressure of exploring ancient ruins built by long-forgotten civilizations. Ruins which are ridden with a plethora of hidden traps and contraptions that are the stuff of sci-fi, if this genre of fiction even existed in this universe. Which it didn't, but hey, I'm pretty proud of this analogy, so I'm fucking keeping... While I praised Risen for being a huge step up in terms of presentation over the Gothic trilogy, this game is not devoid of its fair share of jank. It's not exactly on the same level of Jank City, but it's pretty close. Similar to other AA games, the more you play, the more frequently you start noticing the vestiges of its small budget. Then there's the performance problems. You might have noticed some random stutters in the footage I used. Initially they were caused by some problems from my end that I've since fixed with the help of my buddy Darth Zombie, check out his channel by the way, and then they started occurring again. So, you know, sorry for that. I tried every possible fix I could find. I'm not a fan of the texture and shadow work either. But man, the art direction makes up for that. Just look at the sunset in Harbor Town. Look me in the eye and tell me it doesn't give you an urge to just sit down and write a Midwestern emo album on the spot. Cause that's what I would have done if I knew how to play an instrument. Any instrument. Anyway, moving on, I want to talk a bit about Faranga itself. which in true Piranha Bytes fashion is the actual main character of the game. At its core, Faranga is a predominantly mountainous island with a deliciously Mediterranean geography and vibe. Think of it as a combination between Jarkandar from Gothic 2 Night of the Raven and Toussaint from The Witcher 3. At the center of the island stands a towering active volcano which is visible from almost any point of the island. Settlements of all shapes and sizes dot Faranga, from small farms, hunting encampments to rundown castles and ancient decrepit ruins. Then you got your damp and dusty catacombs where all manner of beasts lurk, and dungeons riddled with traps, ready to end the life of reckless adventurers. While Faranga is very small compared to your typical open world, it's shockingly diverse in terms of geography. You got your mountains, rolling hills, woods, swamps, caves. You'd think cramming so many biomes in such a small place would make for some pretty jarring transitions, but no, they mesh with each other quite naturally. Faranga also has a ton of verticality, which makes the island very satisfying to explore. It's yet another example of great use of space from Piranha Bytes, who have always had a knack for creating these compact, dense worlds which feel much bigger than they actually are. The one thing that contributes to that illusion is the sheer density of stuff spread throughout the game world, be it monsters or treasures. It's the kind of game where you set about to do a specific thing and then you get distracted by something else not 10 meters after the point you started at. You leave the safety of your base to rummage through some skeleton-infested ruins, and the next thing you know, you realize you've been picking plants and clearing out goblin camps for the past hour. You enter a cave that you're way too underleveled for, fight a dozen or so ghouls one by one with your ass cheeks clenched because these fuckers are basically insta-kill delivering machines at this point in the game, and then instead of retreating, you're struck by this irrational, almost masochistic sense of curiosity and push a little bit further. Kind of like a horror movie character in a parking lot that decides to investigate the source of that clearly ominous noise instead of getting into the car and bolting it. There's something about these freaking Piranha Bytes games, man. They have this almost uncanny ability to push you to explore, to let go of your fears and seek out places that you shouldn't. Another aspect I want to touch on is Risen's immersion-centric design. I already deep dived into this stuff in my Gothic 2 video, so I'm not gonna do it here because nothing much has changed across the two games. Also, I encourage you to go ahead and watch that video in case that wasn't obvious until now. Anyway, in case you're new to the Piranha Bytes school of RPGs, their approach to immersive design boils down to this. A bunch of micro mechanics that, while they don't have a significant impact on the gameplay, they make the world feel more real and tangible. Things like, I don't know, replenishing a small amount of health by washing your face in a barrel, cooking at campfires and stoves, NPCs reacting negatively when you break into their properties and or steal their belongings, NPCs knocking you out in neutral zones instead of killing you, wild creatures giving you a few warning signs before attacking, the fact that NPCs don't offer you information willingly, you always have to offer them something in return, and so much more. Now, it's worth mentioning that some of these immersive mechanics are not as refined in Risen as they were in Gothic 2. For example, for Gothic 2, Piranha Bytes designed a quite advanced for its time natural hierarchy. In Gothic 2 there was a clear food chain in place, and some animals displayed cannibalistic behavior while others didn't, for example. There are some traces of that in Risen, but they're just that, traces. Like, I've seen certain animals like wolves and stingrats feeding off of animal carcasses, but I didn't notice any animals actively hunting each other. Another inconsistency is related to, I don't even know what to call it, the AI that handles the distribution of private property amongst NPCs. Let's call it the real estate AI and leave it at that. Anyway, this thing's all over the place. One day an entire neighborhood comes at you with pitchforks and torches for putting one foot into someone's house, and the next you're looting a merchant's backyard without anyone reacting. It's also very easy to cheese. Here's me outrunning an ogre guard and looting an entire Inquisition warehouse. I don't know, I'd be lying if I said these issues didn't bother me, but you know, it is what it is. I have a sneaking suspicion that for Risen, Piranha Bytes deprioritized these mechanics to some degree to address the biggest pain points of Gothic 2, the combat and the progression system. Which takes us to the gameplay.
They say pace always runs downhill. That why you keep coming back here?
Let's get one thing out of the way. Risen is way more accessible than Gothic 1 and 2, both in terms of its difficulty and gameplay mechanics. In fact, it's so approachable that I'm afraid it might put off people from playing the first two Gothic games after having played Risen. So, if you're a newcomer to Piranha Bytes games, I recommend going through Gothic 1 and 2 before this one. That being said, for the sake of keeping this video as concise as possible and not spoiling your opportunity to discover the nuances of the gameplay on your own, I'm gonna only touch on the highlights and restrain myself from deep diving into the mechanics. Anyway, Risen is at its core a combat-centric RPG, with a focus on exploration and some light questing. In true Piranha Bytes fashion, you start the game as a useless, confused newcomer, and you work your way up in the pecking order until you become an absolute force of nature. This brings us to the progression system. In typical RPG fashion, you gain XP by killing mobs and completing quests, and once you haul enough XP, you level up and are allocated 10 learning points. These learning points can be invested in either attributes or talents. The stats are pretty straightforward. Strength and dexterity dictate what weapons you can yield and the amount of damage. As for talents, lockpicking allows you to break into increasingly difficult chests as you invest points into it. And the same principle applies to alchemy and the level of sophistication of the potions you can brew. Other notable talents worth mentioning are smithing, which is for crafting weapons, and prospecting, an ability that allows you to mine for crafting materials such as ore and gold. There's also sneaking and pickpocketing, which I ignored because I went for a strength/fighter build. Oh, and magic. Again, I ignored magic related talents completely for the same reason. Risen has basically the same skill point allocation system as the Gothic games. You don't simply open a menu and turn skill points into pixels. You have to go to dedicated trainers, which are spread throughout the game world. Fortunately, Piranha Bytes didn't use the same attribute balancing system from Gothic 2. The way it worked is that you'd get diminishing returns for spending learning points into attributes. You should see an example on the screen right about now. Things are less complicated this time around. 5 learning points will get you a 5-point increase in a given stat, and 10 learning points translate into 1 level of a talent. The only thing that changes is the monetary cost of each upgrade. The more you advance, the more expensive it gets. It's simple and elegant. What's cool is that every time you train a specific talent, you get a bit of flavor dialogue from the trainer explaining the gist of what you learned. It doesn't have any impact on the gameplay, but it definitely adds to immersion. There is another layer to progression which involves the way Risen gates content. The player technically has access to most of the island from level 1, with the exception of certain areas which unlock as the player progresses through the main quest. However, the paths leading further into the island are always blocked by monsters and creatures that can easily destroy a low-level character. Once the player acquires better skills and equipment, they can go back and try again. And trust me, you'll get your ass handed to you a lot in Risen. Here's me trying and failing to beat these skeletons on 3 separate occasions until I finally managed to destroy them. And while we're at it, why the fuck are skeletons so powerful in video games? They're literally just mounds of decaying bones. Is there a psychopath going around and dumping canisters of milk on skeletons or what? Anyway, along with skeletons, Risen has a pretty decent variety of creatures and monsters. Many of them are reskins of Gothic 2 creatures: scavengers, sea vultures, shadow beasts, ash beasts, war crickets, mine crawlers, ogres and lizardmen orcs, moths, bloodflies, and so on. By the way, I don't view this as a negative. I don't mind devs repackaging stuff if it fits the game. It's just that I enjoy looking for these similarities and connections. Granted, what's new in the monster department really stands out. I love the design of thunder lizards, which are these giant half-turtle, half-lizard behemoths. I also dig their take on ghouls. They're so disgusting and off-putting, and they have magical abilities too for some reason. As expected, in Risen, you'll be fighting a lot of these things. Which brings us to the combat. Let's start with the basics. The player has access to a wide variety of attack moves, as well as parries, blocks and dodges. Dealing damage depends on a number of factors, from positioning, the usage of shields and the attack type. Another interesting addition comes in the form of weapon types. There are 3 melee types, swords, axes and staves, and 2 range types, bows and crossbows, which can only be trained by specialized trainers. You also have melee skills. Investing points points into them unlocks various offensive and defensive options. For instance, sword fighting level 2 grants access to lateral attacks, essentially a crowd control ability. With sword fighting level 6, you can yield bastard swords with one hand. The next level unlocks charge attacks which break through the enemy's parry. These are just a few examples, there's so much ground to cover here, and I haven't even touched on the various tactical possibilities emerging from this combat system. So yeah, it's clear that Piranha Bytes made an effort to overhaul the combat system. Here's the problem though, the combat is kinda broken. Not in the haha so endearingly janky broken, no. First, Risen uses a soft lock auto-targeting system. You lock on an enemy by engaging them in combat and you disengage by moving your mouse to the left or right. This might seem intuitive, but oh boy, wait until an enemy runs around you or dodges an attack and the lock-on is too slow to catch up. In a game as brutally difficult as Risen, that 2-second interval where you lose control of the camera can mean the difference between life and death. I wish this stupid lock-on system, which, believe it or not, is even worse in Elex, was the biggest issue of the combat, but no, there's more. So, in a dodge-based action RPG such as Risen, enemy attacks need to be clearly telegraphed to give the player enough time to react accordingly. There's a certain game revolving around souls that's notorious for nailing this principle almost to perfection. Well, in Risen, attacks are instant and unless you're an Adderall-based life form, you have no way to see them coming. Dodging is also terrible. If you manage to avoid an enemy's attack, they'll more often than not just turn around abruptly and hit you from the side. Consequently, as you advance through Risen's 4 chapters and encounter increasingly stronger enemies, combat gradually devolves into an attrition game. It becomes less about chaining attacks, parrying and approaching each encounter tactically, and more about pumping the relevant stat in the hopes of out-damaging enemies. It's such a shame, the combat showed so much promise in the first few hours. And trust me, I know I'm bad at video games and I abstain from criticizing combat systems for this exact reason. But in the case of Risen, I felt I needed to give newcomers a fair warning. If there's one thing that makes the combat more bearable, that would be a friendly skeleton named Fred. You can summon him via a scroll found pretty early in the campaign, and let me tell you, this dude carried my ass for many hours. Until I lost him for like 10 hours because he got stuck in the terrain somewhere in the wilderness. We reunited eventually, and then he died an honorable death at the hands of Gerger, a legendary creature lurking in the depths of a skeleton-infested castle. Rip my boy Fred. See, now I feel bad for trashing the combat because everything else is so high quality it nearly makes up for the frustrations caused by it. The writing, the characters you talk to, the quests. The quests, oh my god. When looked at with a critical eye, there's not much going for them. They all boil down to go to a certain location and kill/recover something for the quest giver. But the stories the writers crafted around them elevate them to more than simple fetch quests. A cool quest revolves around the power struggle between Brogar and Don Esteban, which you can participate in as a double agent at the behest of the Don's wife, Rachel. If you reveal to Rachel that Brogar had you collect protection money from the non-fighter faction members, she tells you to play along and collect the money anyway in the hopes of gathering more proof pointing to Brogar's scheming to depose Don Esteban. Man, hearing the disappointment in the voices of these people who've helped you before really hurt. Too bad there's no dialogue option to let them know it was just a ploy to gather evidence against Brogar. More often than not, quests will overlap, conveying the game world with a sense of interconnectedness. Early in my playthrough, I met this dude in the middle of the woods who'd been afflicted with a curse after stealing a ring from an undead ruin. Later, you encounter his mother, who was worried sick about her 3 missing sons, and she begs you to go out and look for them. There's more to this quest than meets the eye, so I'm gonna stop here. At the same time, some opposing faction quests overlap, which forces you to make a moral judgment and pick a side. Favoring one quest over the other will obviously cancel entire quest lines, and I'll always respect developers that are not afraid to lock large chunks of content according to the player's decisions. If I were to name one thing that bugged me, and this has less to do with the questing system and more with the world design, is that the world's reactivity to player choice is kind of all over the place. Here's a small example. Tilda, the worried mother I mentioned earlier, complained about being treated badly by a certain merchant. I broke into his shop and kicked his ass just to see what happened, and yeah, she acknowledged it. This wasn't part of any quest, by the way, it's just a small action that the designers accounted for. Pretty cool. At the opposite side of the spectrum, I was at the monastery on an official visit as Don Esteban's emissary, so already a high-ranking member of the bandits, and some of the NPCs were acting as if I was there as a recruit, or mage novice, or whatever the fuck their equivalent of a new member is. It's very bizarre that they didn't account for such a major thing. So to wrap up this section in the most obnoxiously simplified manner, quests could overcompensate for the faults of the combat. Transition.
What is that supposed to mean?
Despite its jank and misguided combat system, Risen is an engrossing RPG that will captivate you for many hours. That's the critical quote-unquote objective main takeaway of this video, but I think the significance of this game goes beyond just being a decent RPG developed by a beloved AA studio. Risen marked both a return to form for Piranha Bytes and the end of a long, tumultuous, but ultimately creatively enriching chapter. It's an apology to their fans and a heads up that things are about to change in game form. And if you followed them the past few years, you probably know things got super messy. But with Risen, Piranha Bytes played to their strengths and delivered what is essentially the ultimate Gothic game. The game that they would have made back in 2000 if they had the experience and technology. And that's why I urge you to check out this game, because man, it's got a lot of soul. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.